The last thing Seris Draymoor saw before the guards dragged her out of her own home was her father's face, and there was no doubt in it. No hesitation. No flicker of the man who used to carry her on his shoulders through the orchard when she was 6 years old and scared of thunder. Just a cold, finished decision, the kind a man makes about a stranger, not a daughter. "Take the traitor away," Duke Aldrich Draymoor said, and he did not even raise his voice. Behind him stood her stepmother, Lady Yvain, dabbing at eyes that held no tears, and beside her, smiling with the soft, satisfied curve of a cat that has just finished a bowl of cream, stood her half-sister Ophelia. Nobody in that hall asked for proof. Nobody asked Seris to speak. The letter that supposedly proved she had sold Velmore's border defenses to the enemy kingdom of Ashkar had appeared in her own writing desk that very morning. Sealed with her own signet ring, a ring she had not worn in 3 days because it was being resized by the court jeweler. She tried to say this. Her voice was swallowed by the shouting of the court guard. 5 years later, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a merchant's calm smile would walk back through the gates of Draymoor Hall, and not one person would recognize her as the daughter they had thrown into the sea. 3 days before the accusation, Seris Draymoor had been the second most trusted person in the duchy, right after her father himself. She kept the ledgers of 3 border garrisons in her head better than the stewards kept them on paper. She had grown up correcting the tutors on troop movements and grain tariffs, the kind of girl the older lords called wasted as a daughter, which they meant as a compliment in their thick-headed way, and which she had always privately resented. Because why should competence need a body to excuse it? She loved her father. That was the part that would take her the longest to burn out of herself in the years that followed. She loved the way his laugh rattled the windows, the way he still, even at 50, called her Little Hawk, because as a child she used to perch on the highest wall of the practice yard to watch the soldiers train. She did not love her stepmother, and she had never pretended to. Yvain had married into House Draymoor 8 years after Seris's mother died of a fever, and from the very first week, there had been a current running under the surface of the household, cold and quiet, like a river beneath ice. Ophelia was Yvain's daughter from a first marriage, sharp-chinned, quick-tongued, and endlessly, hungrily aware that she would inherit nothing unless something changed. Seris did not find out what that something was until the morning the royal inspectors arrived unannounced, boots crunching on the gravel of the east courtyard, and demanded to search her private study. On whose authority? She had asked, still in her dressing robe, hair unbound, more confused than afraid. Fear came later. Confusion came first, and confusion is a dangerous thing to feel when men are already reaching for you. On the authority of a letter received by the Crown 3 days ago, the lead inspector said, unrolling a parchment that made her stomach drop through the floor. It was a detailed account of the fortification schedule at Ashwatch Garrison, troop rotations, supply timing, the exact week the north wall would be undermanned for repairs. Real information. Information only a handful of people in the entire duchy possessed. Information she possessed. And at the bottom, in ink that looked horrifyingly like her own hand, her signature. "I didn't write that," she said, and heard how thin her own voice sounded in the big stone hall. "I didn't send anything to anyone. Test the ink, test the parchment. Ask the jeweler about my ring, he has had it since Tuesday." Nobody tested anything. That was the detail that would keep her awake for years afterward, turning it over and over like a stone in her palm until the edges wore smooth with hate. Nobody tested a single thing. Because by the time the inspectors reached the study, her father was already standing in the doorway. And he was not looking at her like a man who wanted the truth. He was looking at her like a man who had already decided what the truth would be. Because the truth he wanted was cheaper, easier, and came with a very convenient side effect. It cleared the way for Ophelia to be recognized as his sole legitimate heir before the coming Winter Council, when succession disputes across the kingdom were being quietly resolved by whichever families moved fastest. Seris did not understand this yet. She only understood that her father's eyes, the eyes that used to crinkle when she made him laugh, were flat and hard as river stones, and that he said the word traitor the way another man might say stranger. There was no trial. That was the second detail that would keep her awake. In a duchy that prided itself on law and order, on the old Velmoor codes that guaranteed even convicted murderers a hearing before 3 magistrates, Seris Draymoor was given nothing. Her father invoked an old, nearly forgotten clause of noble household law, the right of correction, which allowed a head of household to discipline a family member accused of treason against the crown without a public trial, provided the crown was notified within the week. It was a clause meant for minor infractions 2 centuries ago, dusted off now for exactly one purpose: speed and silence. "You're not even going to let me speak in front of the magistrates." Seris had said when they told her, and for the first time that cold, hard place behind her father's eyes had cracked, just slightly, just for a breath, and something that might have been shame passed over his face like a cloud shadow on a field. "It's for your own protection," Yvain said smoothly, stepping in exactly the way she always stepped in whenever her husband's resolve wavered. "A public trial for treason ends in a public execution, Seris. This way you simply disappear. Quietly, mercifully. Mercifully." Seris would remember that word for the rest of her life. Would take it out sometimes in the dark of whatever room she was hiding in and turn it over like a coin with a counterfeiter's mark, admiring, in a sick sort of way, how perfectly Yvain had chosen it. Mercifully, as though being thrown off a cliff into the Straits of Kel, hands bound, with the tide running fast and cold enough to stop a heart in 4 minutes, was an act of tenderness. "Father," she said one last time as the guards took her arms, "look at me. Please, you know me, you have known me 19 years. Do you truly believe I would do this?" And here was the detail that broke something in her chest that never in 5 years fully mended. Her father did not answer. He turned his face away first, and only after that did he say to the guards and not to her, "Take the traitor away." He could not even look at her while he condemned her. Some small, stubborn part of Seris chose to believe, in that instant and for a long time afterward, that this meant he did not truly believe it, that somewhere inside him a war was being fought and lost. It was a belief that would cost her dearly before the story was through, because the truth, when she finally excavated it years later from a dying man's confession, was worse than simple cowardice. Her father had not looked away because he doubted her guilt. He had looked away because he already knew she was innocent, and had chosen to condemn her anyway. The guards marched her through the long gallery, past the portraits of 6 generations of Draymoors, past the tapestry her mother had woven the year Seris was born, out into a gray morning that smelled of salt and coming rain. Ophelia did not come to the courtyard to watch her go. She did not need to. She was already upstairs, in what had been Seris's mother's old rooms, trying on a string of pearls that had, until that morning, belonged to someone else's future. The last thing Seris heard as the gates of Draymoor Hall closed behind her was her stepmother's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry, remarking to a servant that it was such a shame, really, but at least now the succession question could finally be settled without any unpleasantness. Unpleasantness. She held onto that word too, filed it away next to mercifully. 2 small stones she would build an entire foundation of vengeance upon in the years to come. Because if there was one thing 19-year-old Seris Draymoor had never been taught, and would teach herself instead alone. In the dark salt-scoured caves along the smuggler's coast, where fishermen eventually found half-drowned wreckage of a girl who should have died 4 minutes into that freezing tide, it was this: the people who destroy you rarely feel the weight of what they've done. You have to make them feel it. Nobody else will do it for you. She did not know yet how she would survive that water. She only knew, as the rope was tied around her wrists and the guards walked her toward the cliff edge at Kel Point, that she intended to. The Straits of Kel had a reputation among sailors that even landsmen knew. What goes in rarely comes out, and what comes out rarely comes out whole. The current beneath the cliffs ran in 2 directions at once, a treacherous braid of warm and cold water that had claimed entire fishing fleets in a single bad season. It was, everyone agreed, the perfect place to make an inconvenient noblewoman disappear without the mess of a public execution. Seris remembered very little of the fall itself, a rush of gray sky, the guards' faces already turning away before she hit the water, as though even they could not bear to watch, and then the cold. She had never imagined cold like that. It did not feel like temperature. It felt like a hand closing around her ribs and squeezing. What she remembered clearly with the strange sharp clarity that comes to people in the worst moments of their lives was the single decision she made in the 4 seconds before the current took her under. She twisted her bound wrists against the wet rope, felt it slip a half-inch against her skin, and did not stop twisting even as the water filled her mouth. Even as her lungs began to burn, even as the last gray light above her started to look very far away and very unimportant. She would later tell the man who saved her that she did not remember deciding to survive. She simply remembered refusing to stop moving her hands. His name was Doran, and he was not a nobleman, not a soldier, not anyone of consequence in the world Seris had come from, which was, as it turned out, exactly why he was the only person capable of saving her. Because everyone of consequence in her world already thought her dead and had stopped looking. Doran was a smuggler who ran contraband salt and undocumented grain along the Kel coast in a boat with no name painted on its hull. And he had been running dark that night specifically because a body falling off a cliff into a smuggler's favorite hiding cove was the kind of thing that brought soldiers, and soldiers were bad for business. He almost let her drown. He told her this himself months later with the same blunt honesty he used for everything, sitting across a driftwood fire with a bottle of rough spirits between them. "Fished up nobles mean trouble," he said. "I've pulled 2 out of that water in 15 years, and both times it cost me a season's profit in bribes to keep the magistrates from asking where I'd been." "Why did you pull me out then?" Seris had asked. "Because you were still fighting the rope when I got the boat hook under your arm," Doran said, and shrugged like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Never met anyone who fought that hard for 4 minutes straight while drowning. Figured someone that stubborn probably had a reason to live worth finding out about." She spent the first 3 weeks of her new life in a smuggler's cave along the Kel coast, wrapped in stolen wool blankets, coughing seawater out of lungs that never quite felt the same again. Listening to Doran's crew argue in low voices about whether to sell information about her to the highest bidder. A disgraced noblewoman thought dead would fetch a fine price from at least 4 different parties who might want her found. Or might want her silenced properly this time, or whether to simply let her go once she could walk and forget they'd ever seen her. It was an old woman named Myril, Doran's mother and the only person in the smugglers' camp who had lost patience with everyone's greed, who made the decision for them. "Look at her hands," Myril said, examining the raw, rope-scarred wrists that Seris hid under her sleeves even in the cave's damp warmth. "That's not a girl who's going to sit quiet and grateful in some corner. That's a girl who's already planning something. You sell her to the highest bidder, you've made yourself an enemy who never forgets a face. You let her go, she owes you nothing and remembers you kindly. Which one sounds like better business to you in 10 years? The old woman had, without knowing it, read Seris more accurately in a single glance than her own father had managed in 19 years of watching her grow up. Seris did not go, of course, once she could walk. She stayed. First because she had nowhere else to go, and every coin, every noble connection, every version of her old life had been declared dead along with her body. And then gradually, because she began to understand something the smugglers' camp could teach her that Draymoor Hall never had. Information was the only currency that could not be inherited. Land could be stolen, titles revoked, gold spent to nothing but a person who knew things, who knew where a rival's supply ships anchored on moonless nights, who knew which magistrate could be bought and which could be trusted, who knew the precise week a garrison's north wall would go unmanned for repairs, because after all she was the one who used to keep those ledgers in her head, a person who knew things could never be entirely erased. She started small. She corrected a shipping manifest Doran's crew had bungled, saving them from a customs inspection that would have cost them their entire cargo. She noticed within a month that one of Doran's regular buyers was systematically shorting them on payment by exploiting a currency exchange the crew didn't fully understand, and she fixed it in an afternoon with nothing but a piece of chalk and a flat rock to write on. Within 6 months, the woman the smugglers had fished half-drowned out of the Straits of Kel was quietly running the financial and logistical backbone of an operation that stretched across 4 coastal towns, and nobody outside that small, loyal circle knew her real name. She took a new one, Ashe. Short, plain, forgettable, the opposite in every way of Lady Seris Draymoor, a name that had once opened every door in the duchy, and now she understood clearly would get her killed the moment anyone connected it to a living, breathing woman instead of a body the sea was supposed to have kept. But a name is not the same as a wound, and the wound did not close just because she'd renamed herself. Some nights, curled in the damp cave with the sound of the tide outside, she still heard her father's voice. Take the traitor away. Still saw him turn his face from her, choosing not to look, the coward's last privilege. She did not yet know why he had done it. Did not yet know about the marriage alliance with Ashkar's border lords that Yvain had been quietly negotiating for 2 years, an alliance that required House Draymoor's heir to be unmarried, unencumbered, and entirely conveniently without an older half-sister whose competence made her a threat to the succession Yvain intended for her own daughter. She only knew in those early months one simple and clarifying truth. The family that had thrown her away had never once, not for a single day, imagined she might come back. That was the mistake she intended to make them regret. By the end of her first year among the smugglers of Kel Coast, Ashe, no longer entirely Seris, not yet entirely someone new, had begun asking Doran's crew quiet questions about a very particular kind of information broker who operated 3 kingdoms over. In the free port city of Corvath, a woman rumored to trade in secrets so valuable that even kings paid her tribute, rather than risk becoming her enemy. If Seris Draymoor was going to be reborn as someone capable of dismantling one of the most powerful noble houses in Velmore from the outside in, she would need more than a smuggler's ledger skills and a stubborn will to survive. She would need to become the most dangerous kind of woman there was, one who owed nothing to anyone, feared no one's name, and had absolutely nothing left to lose. She booked passage to Corveth on a grain ship 3 weeks later. Using a dead woman's papers and a name that wasn't hers, carrying nothing but a small bag of coin, a set of rope-scarred wrists she never let anyone see uncovered, and a list, mental only, never written down. Because written things could be found, of every single person who had stood in that hall the day her father chose a lie over his own daughter. She had 5 years, she decided, watching the coastline of Velmore disappear behind the ship's wake. 5 years to become someone Draymoor Hall would never see coming. She did not yet know that the sea she was leaving behind would not be finished with her family's secrets either. That somewhere beneath the calm surface of House Draymoor's sudden prosperity lay a second betrayal even colder than the first. One that had put her in that water not to punish a crime but to clear a path for one. Corveth was nothing like Velmore. Where the duchy's capital smelled of horses and cut hay and old stone, Corveth smelled of tar, foreign spice, and the particular sourness of 100 languages shouted across a single crowded harbor at once. It was a free port, belonging to no crown, governed instead by a council of merchant guilds who valued exactly one thing above all others: that business, whatever its nature, be allowed to proceed uninterrupted. It took Ashe 4 months of careful, patient work, first as a scribe copying manifests for a shipping house, then as an underclerk untangling a merchant's badly kept accounts, to earn an audience with the woman she had crossed 3 kingdoms to find. They called her the Quiet Widow, though no one Ashe ever met could confirm she had actually been married, or widowed, or was even the age she appeared to be. What was certain was that the Quiet Widow's information network reached into every noble house, every trade guild, every royal court from Velmore to the eastern deserts, and that she had never once been caught selling a secret to the wrong buyer, because she never sold anything until she had already calculated exactly what its owner could afford to lose. The audience took place in a room with no windows, lit by exactly 3 lamps, in a townhouse that from the outside looked like a modest wool merchant's residence and nothing more. "You're the girl who fixed Havern's currency problem," the Quiet Widow said, without looking up from the papers on her desk. She was small, gray-haired, dressed in the plain wool of a shopkeeper, and utterly bone-deep unnerving in a way Ashe couldn't name until much later. The stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority because she simply possessed it. "Word travels faster in this city than you'd think for someone so careful about her own name." "I'd like to work for you," Ashe said. "Everyone would like to work for me. Most of them want money or protection or a way to hurt someone who hurt them." The Quiet Widow finally looked up, and her eyes moved over Ashe's face with an assessment so thorough it felt almost physical, like being weighed on a scale. "Which is it for you?" Ashe had rehearsed a dozen careful lies on the boat over, half-truths designed to reveal nothing while asking for everything. She said none of them. Something about the stillness of that windowless room made lying feel not just risky, but stupid, a wasted opening move against an opponent who would see through it in a heartbeat and never trust her again. "The third one," she said. "Someone hurt me. I intend for them to understand exactly how thoroughly before I'm finished." That's an honest answer. Most people lie about that one especially. The Quiet Widow set down her pen. "Tell me who." "Not yet," Ashe said. "Not until you've decided whether to teach me or throw me out. If it's the second, I'd rather you not know a name that might be useful to sell." For the first time, something that might almost have been the ghost of a smile crossed the old woman's face. "Good instinct. Most people your age haven't learned yet that trust is a transaction like any other, and the safest position is the one where you owe the least and know the most." She gestured to a chair. "Sit down. I'll teach you 3 things, and after that, whether you stay or go is entirely a question of how well you learn them. First, information is worth nothing until you know precisely who is afraid to lose it. Second, the deadliest secrets are never the ones people hide, those everyone half expects to find eventually. The deadliest secrets are the ones people have convinced themselves are already forgotten." And third, the Quiet Widow leaned forward, and her voice dropped, not louder but somehow heavier. "Revenge executed in anger is a story people tell about you for a season and then forget. Revenge executed patiently, precisely, so that the people who wronged you destroy themselves believing it was their own doing, that is a story people remember for 100 years, and more importantly, child, it is the only kind that actually works." Ashe stayed 4 years. She learned to read a room of merchants the way she had once read troop ledgers, instantly, instinctively, cataloging weakness and leverage in the space of a greeting. She learned 6 languages well enough to eavesdrop without suspicion, and learned that the 6th the old court dialect of Ashkar. was the one that would matter most because it was in a letter written in that exact dialect, intercepted by one of the Quiet Widow's agents in her second year in Corvath, and sold to Ashe for a favor rather than coin. That she finally found the shape of the second betrayal. The letter was 18 months old by the time she read it, written by an Ashkar border lord named Rastan Vey to an unnamed correspondent inside Velmor, thanking his partner in House Draymoor for the fortification schedules that had allowed a quiet and profitable arrangement along the border. An arrangement the letter made clear that had been running for over 2 years before Seris Draymoor was ever accused of anything. Ashe read it 3 times in the lamplit quiet of her small room above a chandler's shop, and each time the same cold understanding settled deeper into her bones. The information leaked to Ashkar had been real. Someone inside House Draymoor genuinely had been selling fortification schedules across the border for 2 years for profit systematically, but it had not been her. She had never once corresponded with anyone in Ashkar, had never even visited the border garrisons whose schedules were leaked, because her father had always kept the most sensitive frontier postings to himself and a single trusted steward. A single trusted steward. A name she had not thought of in 4 years surfaced in her memory with the force of a physical blow. Cassian Rain, her father's steward of 12 years, the quiet, competent man who had helped raise her almost as much as any parent. Who had taught her to read ledgers in the first place, who had access to every garrison schedule in the duchy, and had somehow conveniently never once been suspected of anything, because everyone's suspicion had been so neatly, so efficiently redirected toward the Duke's inconvenient elder daughter instead. She did not sleep that night. She sat with the letter until dawn came up gray through the shutters, and by the time the chandler's apprentices began hauling wax down in the street below, Ashe understood the true shape of what had happened to her for the first time since the water closed over her head 5 years. No, 4 years, she corrected herself, 4 years and 8 months before. It had never been about a border defense leak at all, not really. The leak was real, but it was cover, a convenient crime for a convenient scapegoat. The true engine of her destruction had been Yvain's marriage alliance for Ophelia, a treaty with an Ashkar noble house that required House Draymoor's succession to be uncontested, which meant the elder daughter. Competent and beloved by the garrison commanders, and increasingly impossible to marry off, quietly needed to simply cease to exist. Cassian Rain's border selling had given Yvain the perfect weapon sitting there waiting to be aimed, and all it had cost her was a forged signature and a father too weak, or too convinced of his own coming reward, to ask a single hard question about ink and parchment, and a ring that had been at the jeweler's since Tuesday. Her father had known. That was the piece that made Ashe's hands shake. Finally, 4 years too late, sitting alone in a rented room above a chandler's shop 3 kingdoms from home. He had known, or at minimum suspected strongly enough, that a single afternoon's honest investigation would have unraveled the entire lie. And he had chosen not to look because the marriage alliance Yvain had built for Ophelia promised him something he wanted badly enough to sacrifice a daughter for it. A foothold of Draymoor influence inside Ashkar itself, and with it whispers said, a path toward a ducal coronet that might one day be upgraded to something considerably larger if the currently ailing Velmor crown prince continued to produce no heir of his own. Her father had traded her life for a chance at a throne. Ashe folded the letter very carefully along its original creases and locked it inside a small strongbox beneath a loose floorboard, alongside 2 other documents she had spent 4 years quietly, patiently gathering. She did not weep. She had done all her weeping in the first year, in a smuggler's cave with the tide roaring outside, and there was none left now, only a clean, cold clarity, the same clarity that had once let her twist a rope loose underwater while her lungs burned to nothing. She went to the Quiet Widow's townhouse the next morning, and for the first time in 4 years, said the name out loud. Draymoor, the old woman repeated, unsurprised, because of course she had known all along, had likely known from the very first interview 4 years earlier, and simply waited, with the patience of someone who traded in nothing but patience, for Ashe to be ready to say it herself. House Draymoor of Velmor, that is a very large family to bring down, child, even after 4 years of preparation. I'm not asking your permission, Ashe said. I'm telling you I'm going home. I never imagined you were asking permission. The Quiet Widow allowed herself, at last, the full, thin smile she had been rationing for 4 years. I'm simply informing you that if you're finally ready to go, you will need considerably more than a strongbox of old letters and a steady stomach for lies. You will need a name that opens doors, your true one no longer can, a fortune that does not trace back to any port you've ever set foot in, and at least one ally inside Velmor's own court, because a woman working entirely alone against a duke, a duchess. And a kingdom's worth of marriage alliances is a woman who will be found out and quietly disposed of before her second week home is finished. Then help me build all three, Ashe said. The quiet widow studied her for a long moment, the lamplight steady and unblinking between them, and then reached into the drawer of her desk and withdrew a single sealed letter bearing a wax crest Ashe did not recognize, a stylized hawk, wings spread, over crossed keys. There is a man in Velmoor's own royal court, the quiet widow said, the crown's master of coin, who has spent the last 3 years quietly investigating irregular fortification funding along the Ashkar border, and has been repeatedly mysteriously blocked from completing that investigation by interests he has not yet been able to name. His name is Kalen Voss, and he does not know yet that I am aware of his inquiry, or that I have known its true target for over a year. Take this letter to him. Do not use the name Draymoor, do not use the name Seris. Introduce yourself as a merchant financier named Ashe Corvine, with information to sell regarding the Ashkar border funding scandal, and let him discover on his own, in his own time, exactly how far that scandal reaches. Ashe took the letter. Her hands, for the first time in 4 years, were not entirely steady, though not from fear. One more thing, the quiet widow said as Ashe turned to go. You asked me once whether I would teach you or throw you out. I chose to teach you because I recognized something in you the very first day, not ambition, not even grief, though you had plenty of both. I recognized a woman who had already decided before she ever walked into my office that she was going to win. Do not let Velmoor's heir remind you how to lose again. Your father taught you once that love could be traded away for advantage. Do not let him teach you twice that patience can be mistaken for surrender. Ashe, who had once been Seris Draymoor and would, before this was finished, need to become her again publicly, unmistakably, in front of every person who had once watched her dragged from that hall, walked out of the windowless room and into Korvath's crowded sunbright harbor for what she already understood would be the very last time. Somewhere behind her, in a kingdom 3 weeks' sail away, a duke was preparing to announce his younger daughter's betrothal to an Ashkar border lord in a ceremony meant to finally, permanently cement everything his elder daughter's death had purchased for him. He did not know yet that the sea had not kept what he'd thrown into it. Kalen Voss had spent 3 years learning exactly how much a man could be quietly punished for asking the wrong questions. And he had learned it the hard way. A promotion he'd earned twice redirected to a lesser man with better family connections, a promising junior clerk of his suddenly reassigned to a border post with a reputation for fever. An anonymous note left on his desk one morning that said nothing threatening at all, only listed his daughter's school and the hours she walked home from it. He had not stopped his investigation. He had simply gotten better at hiding how far it had progressed. He did not expect, on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, for the answer to 3 years of careful, dangerous work to walk into his office wearing a merchant financier's plain but well-cut coat, introduce herself as Ashe Corvine, and set a sealed letter down on his desk with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her life doubted she belonged in a room. I was told you've been asking questions about irregular fortification funding on the Ashkar border, Ashe said, before he had even finished reading the letter's seal. I have information that would interest you. I'm also aware you've been blocked twice from formally requesting the garrison ledgers you'd need to confirm it, most recently by a request that mysteriously vanished between the Chancellery and the Royal Archive. Kalen set the letter down slowly. He was a tall man in his early 30s, with the ink-stained fingers of someone who did his own accounting rather than trusting clerks, and eyes that had clearly learned the hard way exactly how dangerous curiosity could be in this particular court. Who sent you? He asked. Someone who values discretion as much as you claim to. Ashe took the seat across from his desk without being invited to, which she noted, with private satisfaction, made him blink. Apparently not many people in Velmoor's court sat down before a master of coin gave leave. I'm not here to ask what you already suspect. I'm here to confirm it and give you the one piece you're missing, the name of the steward who's been selling the schedules. She watched something in his face go very still. You have proof. I have a letter, 18 months old, in the Ashkar border lord's own hand, thanking his partner in House Draymoor for 2 years of profitable arrangement. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as she'd learned, in 4 years at the quiet widow's side, would make a man lean forward rather than lean back. I also have testimony that the woman publicly executed for this crime 5 years ago was innocent of it entirely, and was in fact the one person in that household with both the access and the competence to have noticed the real leak. Which is precisely why she needed to disappear before she did. Kalen Voss did not react the way she expected. She had prepared for skepticism, for careful bureaucratic caution, even for outright dismissal, Master of Coin was a position that survived by not making noble enemies unnecessarily. Instead, his jaw tightened, and something that looked uncomfortably like old banked anger surfaced behind his eyes. Seris Draymoor, he said quietly, it was not a question. Ashe went very still herself. I didn't give you that name. You didn't need to. I sat on the same border fortification review committee as her father for 2 years before her, before what happened. She was the only person in that room who ever asked me a question I couldn't immediately answer. Everyone else in that duchy treated garrison funding like a formality to be rubber-stamped. She read every line. He was watching her now with an entirely different kind of attention, the sharp, recalculating focus of a man rebuilding an entire 5-year-old assumption in real time. I remember thinking, when the news came that she'd been thrown into the Straits of Kel for treason, that it made no sense. Not because I liked her, I barely knew her, but because everything I'd seen of her mind said she was the least likely person in that household to make the kind of careless mistake treason like that would require. I filed the thought away as grief for a dead colleague and moved on, because moving on was the only safe option available to a master of coin who valued his own daughter's safety. You're going to have to decide right now, Ashe said, whether you're still that man or whether 3 years of being quietly punished for asking honest questions has changed your mind about what's safe. Kalen Voss was quiet for a long moment, turning the sealed letter over in his ink-stained fingers. Say I believe every word of this, he said finally. Say I even believe the woman sitting across from my desk right now is somehow, impossibly, Seris Draymoor herself, alive 5 years later wearing another name. What is it you actually want from me? Not vengeance, I assume you can arrange that yourself, given how thoroughly you seem to have prepared. You want something specific. She had been waiting 4 years to answer this question, and she found when the moment finally arrived that the answer came out steadier than she expected. I want the Crown to open a formal treason investigation into House Draymoor, Ashe said. Not a quiet one, not a right of correction invoked in a private hall with no magistrates present. A full, public, undeniable investigation, with royal inspectors and a proper trial, the exact process my father denied me 5 years ago. I want Cassian Rain exposed as the actual source of the leak. I want the marriage alliance between Ophelia Draymoor and House Vey of Ashkar stopped before it's finalized, because that alliance is the entire reason my death was arranged in the first place. And I want the Crown to understand precisely how deep that treason runs before anyone signs a single betrothal contract. And I want it done in a way that my father, my stepmother, and my half-sister are given every opportunity to save themselves by telling the truth, and choose instead to keep lying in front of witnesses who cannot be silenced or reassigned to fever postings. You want them to condemn themselves. I want the same thing the quiet widow taught me 4 years ago in a windowless room in Corvath, Ashe said. Revenge that people can dismiss as the bitterness of a wronged woman lasts a season. Revenge that forces guilty people to destroy themselves in front of the entire court, using nothing but their own choices and their own greed, lasts considerably longer. I don't need to lift a sword against my father, Master Voss. I only need to make certain that when the truth finally reaches him, he has no one left to blame it on but himself. It took another 6 weeks of careful work to build the case Kalen Voss could safely bring before the Crown. 6 weeks of matching the intercepted Ashkar letter against genuine Draymoor garrison ledgers that Kalen quietly re-requested under a new unrelated pretext. 6 weeks of Ashe moving through Velmore's capital in the guise of a merchant financier scouting investment opportunities, gathering fragments of confirmation from old household staff, who remembered things they'd never been asked about from a jeweler's apprentice who still had in an old ledger. The exact date Lady Seris's signet ring had been brought in for resizing 3 days before it supposedly signed a confession she never wrote. And it was during those 6 weeks moving quietly through streets she had once ridden down in an open carriage as her father's proud competent daughter, that Ashe encountered the one complication the quiet widow's careful planning had not accounted for. A man named Wren, a former garrison captain turned private investigator hired, she would learn only later, and with a chill that took days to fully thaw by her own father. To look into the sudden curious presence of a merchant financier named Ashe Corvine, who had been asking uncomfortably specific questions about border fortifications and old household staff. Duke Aldrich Draymoor, it seemed, had not entirely stopped watching his own shadows, even 5 years after he believed he'd erased the one shadow that should have worried him most. Wren Ashcombe had been a garrison captain for 11 years before a training accident took the use of 2 fingers on his left hand, and with them, any hope of active command. He had spent the 2 years since learning a second trade, quiet investigation. The kind noble houses paid for when they needed a problem examined without the scandal of hiring anyone official. And he was by every account Ashe gathered in her first careful week of watching him watch her extremely good at it. She noticed him on the fourth day, a broad-shouldered man in unremarkable clothes who lingered 2 shops longer than coincidence should allow outside the tailor's where she'd had 3 merchants' coats made, who took the same evening route through the flower market that she did 3 days running. She did not panic. Panic, the quiet widow had taught her in the very first month of training, was simply information broadcast to your enemy for free. Instead, on the 5th day, she turned around in the middle of the flower market and walked directly toward him. "You've been following me since Tuesday," she said, without preamble, watching his face carefully for the flicker of surprise she was fairly certain wouldn't come and didn't. "Either say what you want or stop wasting both our afternoons." Ren studied her for a long moment, and something that might have been reluctant respect crossed his weathered face. "You're careful, more careful than a merchant financier scouting investments usually needs to be. Careful is a habit that keeps people alive in my line of work. I imagine it's the same in yours." She let the silence stretch, the same trick she'd used on Kalen Voss weeks earlier, and watched it work again. "Who hired you doesn't matter. What matters is that you've been asking a very specific set of questions. Old household staff, a jeweler's records from 5 years back, garrison funding irregularities nobody in this city has cared to look at in years. And my employer would like to know why. Before he decides whether you're a problem worth removing." "Your employer is Duke Aldrich Draymoor," Ashe said, and watched confirmation flicker across Ren's face even though he said nothing to give it. "And he's worried because some part of him has never fully believed his own lie, has he? 5 years of quiet, and the moment someone starts asking the exact right questions, he sends a man to find out if the past is finally catching up to him." Ren's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're implying, and I'd be careful implying it to anyone else in this city. The Duke is a powerful man." "The Duke," Ashe said, "condemned his own daughter to death on forged evidence he never bothered to verify. In order to clear the succession for a marriage alliance his second wife had already been negotiating for 2 years. I'm not implying anything, Captain Ashcombe. I'm telling you a fact you can verify yourself, if you have the stomach for it. Starting with a jeweler's apprentice on Cobblestone Row who still has the receipt for a signet ring brought in for resizing 3 days before it supposedly signed a treason confession. She had gambled in that moment on something the quiet widow had taught her to recognize in men who'd spent their careers protecting institutions rather than individuals. The particular species of loyalty that cracks the instant it discovers the thing it protected was never worth protecting. Ren Ashcombe had commanded a garrison for 11 years. He had, she suspected from the careful way he carried himself, a soldier's old-fashioned belief in honest cause and honest consequence. The kind of belief that made men extremely useful to nobility right up until the moment they discovered the nobility they served had none of it themselves. "You're telling me," Ren said slowly, "that Lady Seris Draymoor is standing in front of me. I'm telling you that I have proof of a 5-year-old miscarriage of justice and that your employer just hired you to find out how close I've come to it," Ashe said. "You can report back to him tonight that a merchant financier is asking dangerous questions, and let him decide how to make me disappear the way he made her disappear 5 years ago. Or you can ask yourself right now, in this market, whether you actually want to spend the rest of your career protecting a man who threw an innocent daughter into the sea to buy himself a marriage alliance." Ren did not answer immediately. He looked for a long moment like a man doing arithmetic he badly did not want to do. "Prove it," he said finally. "Not to me. I've made my decision about what kind of man I want to be a long time ago, and it wasn't the kind who looks away from a murdered child because the man who ordered it signs my pay. Prove it to the crown. In a way that can't be quietly buried the way everything else about that family gets quietly buried, and I'll give you everything I've gathered on the Duke's current movements, his correspondence with House Vey, and the precise date the betrothal contract with Ophelia is meant to be signed." "Why would you help me?" Ashe asked, genuinely curious now, some old buried part of her, the part that still occasionally treacherously missed believing in simple things like honor, wanting to understand. "Because I spent 11 years training soldiers to believe that the chain of command exists to protect the people beneath it, not to sacrifice them for convenience," Ren said. "And because 3 months ago, the Duke had me quietly follow and intimidate a stable boy who'd gotten too curious about why a certain set of old garrison ledgers had gone missing from the archive. The boy was 14. I did it because it was my job and I told myself it was harmless. I've been having trouble sleeping since." He met her eyes. If half of what you're telling me is true, Lady Draymoor, then I've spent 2 years working for a man who murders inconvenient children and calls it discretion. I'd like the chance to stop being part of that before I run out of chances entirely. It took 3 more weeks to assemble the final pieces. Wren's records of Duke Aldrich's correspondence with House Vey showing the betrothal timeline had been deliberately accelerated the moment the Ashwatch border investigation resumed. Kaelin Voss's quietly reconfirmed garrison ledgers, matching precisely against the intercepted Ashkar letter. The jeweler's apprentice, whose testimony about the signet rings resizing date Ashe finally secured with nothing more than an honest conversation, and the promise that testifying against a duke would be handled through crown channels not left to the apprentice's own courage alone. And it was in the final week of that assembly, as Ashe sat with Kaelin Voss and Wren Ashcombe reviewing the last details of the case they intended to bring before the crown, that a fourth piece arrived that none of them had gone looking for, a piece that would change the entire shape of the reckoning Ashe had spent 5 years building. Cassian Rain, her father's steward of 12 years and the true source of the Ashkar leak, sent word through a frightened intermediary that he wished to confess everything in exchange for his life. He had it turned out. Been watching the same signs of unraveling that had sent Duke Aldrich to hire Wren Ashcombe in the first place, and he had reached independently a conclusion that terrified him considerably more than any crown investigation. If the truth came out now in a proper trial with royal inspectors, there would be no convenient scapegoat left to protect him. The daughter he had helped condemn was, by whatever impossible means, no longer available to take the blame a second time. He wants to meet, Kaelin said, reading the message Wren had passed along. Tonight at the old grain warehouse by the eastern docks. He says he has documents, the actual correspondence with House Vey, proof of 2 years of payments, and something else he wouldn't specify in writing, something about the night you were sentenced. Ashe felt something cold and very still settle into her chest, the particular stillness she had learned to recognize over 5 years, as the shape her body took right before the truth of something finally, fully arrived. Something about the night I was sentenced, she repeated. He says, Wren said carefully, watching her face, that the confession letter wasn't the only forged document that night. He says there's a second one, something your father signed, and that he's kept it hidden for 5 years as insurance, in case anyone in that household ever tried to have him quietly removed the way they'd removed you. The grain warehouse by the eastern docks smelled of dust, an old rope lit only by a single shuttered lantern that Cassian Rain kept turned low. As though even in an empty building at midnight, he could not shake the old habit of a man who had spent 12 years hiding things in plain sight. He looked older than Ashe remembered, of course he did. 5 years had passed for him just as they had for her, but there was something beyond simple age in the deep lines around his eyes, the gray that had overtaken what used to be dark hair. He looked like a man who had spent 5 years waiting for a debt to come due. Lady Seris, he said, when she stepped into the lantern light, and his voice cracked slightly on the old title, the one she had not heard spoken aloud sincerely in 5 years. I told myself when the rumors started reaching me about a merchant financier asking questions no ordinary merchant would think to ask, that it couldn't possibly be you. The sea doesn't give people back. It gave me back, Ashe said. 4 minutes in the Straits of Kel with my hands still bound, and a smuggler's boat hook the only thing standing between your convenient scapegoat and an actual grave. You're going to have to live with the inconvenience of that, Master Rain, because I've spent 5 years planning exactly how inconvenient I intend to become. He flinched, but he did not run, and she understood, watching him, that he had already run out of places to run to a long time ago. A man who spends 5 years waiting to be discovered eventually reaches a point where discovery feels almost like relief. I sold the fortification schedules, he said, without prompting, the words coming out fast, like something he'd rehearsed alone in the dark so many times the rehearsal itself had become a kind of relief. 2 years before you were ever accused of anything. I told myself it was a small thing at first, outdated troop rotations, information that would be useless within a season anyway, sold to a border lord who'd have found it out eventually through other channels. And then it wasn't small anymore. And by the time I understood how deep I was, I'd already taken enough coin from House Vey that stopping meant confessing, and confessing meant the noose, and I was a coward, Lady Seris. I want you to hear me say that plainly before anything else. I was a coward and you paid for it. I know, Ashe said. Her voice did not shake, though something in her chest, some old wound she'd thought fully scarred over, ached fiercely at hearing the confession spoken aloud after 5 years of only ever finding it in intercepted letters and second-hand inference. I've known for over a year. What I don't yet understand is why my father chose to condemn me instead of you, when a single afternoon's honest investigation would have pointed directly at your desk instead of mine. Cashin's hands, she noticed, were shaking as he reached into his coat and withdrew a small oilcloth bundle, worn soft with 5 years of careful, anxious handling. Because your father needed you gone regardless of who was actually selling the schedules, he said. The leak gave him a convenient crime. It didn't give him the reason. The reason was always the marriage alliance, and Lady Yvain made certain the very morning the inspectors found that letter in your study, a letter I forged. Lady Seris, I want you to know that too. I copied your hand from 3 years of ledger entries you'd left in my care. She made certain your father understood that a public trial risked the truth coming out in ways neither of them could control while a quiet private right of correction let them control every part of it, including, and here his voice dropped, and his hands shook harder as he unwrapped the oilcloth bundle, including making certain he could never change his mind afterward, even if his conscience woke up too late to matter. He held out a single folded document, its wax seal broken long ago, and Ashe felt the cold, clarifying stillness settle over her again as she took it and unfolded it beneath the lantern light. It was a private letter in her father's own hand. Dated the night before her sentencing, not the forged confession that had condemned her, but a second document entirely one he had apparently signed, and given to Cashin Rain himself for safekeeping in exchange for the steward's continued silence about the true source of the border leaks. In it, Duke Aldrich Draymoor acknowledged in his own words that he held no true evidence beyond reasonable doubt of his daughter's guilt, that the timeline of the signet ring's absence from her possession raises questions I have chosen not to pursue, and that he was proceeding with her sentencing regardless because the alliance with House Vey cannot survive a public trial's uncertainties and the succession must be settled before the Winter Council. He had written it down, he had known and doubted and chosen anyway. And then, in what Ashe understood reading it a second time by lantern light, was the closest thing to genuine guilt her father was capable of. He had put that knowledge into writing and given it to the one man who could use it against him forever. As though some buried part of him had wanted a record to exist even if he could never bring himself to act on it. Why did you keep this instead of destroying it? Ashe asked, her voice very quiet now. Because the day he gave it to me. Cashin said, I understood for the first time exactly how far your father would go to protect his own advantage. And I understood that a man capable of doing that to his own daughter would eventually do it to a steward too. The instant I became inconvenient rather than useful, I kept it as insurance. I told myself for 5 years that I would never actually need it, that I would simply grow old quietly in his service, and the guilt would stay locked in this oilcloth, and no one would ever have to know how thoroughly I had failed you. He looked up, and for the first time, something that might genuinely have been shame rather than fear crossed his face. I did not expect the sea to give you back, Lady Seris. I did not plan for a world in which you might come looking for the truth yourself. Now that you have, I find I would rather hand you the weapon myself than wait for you to find it without my help, and discover afterward that I could have shortened your search and chose instead to protect myself a little longer. Ashe folded the letter carefully back along its original creases, the same care she had once given the Ashkar correspondence in a rented room above a chandler's shop 3 kingdoms away, and looked at the steward who had helped raise her, betrayed her, and was now in the strange, complicated arithmetic of 5 years' distance, handing her the single most damning piece of evidence she would ever need. What do you want in exchange for this? She asked, because the quiet widow had taught her that no one, not even a genuinely repentant man, gave away something this valuable for nothing, and she needed to know the price before she accepted the gift. A trial, Cashin said, a real one in front of the crowd, where I can confess everything I did, the leak, the forgery, all of it, and face whatever judgment the law actually requires rather than living the rest of my life the way your father lived the last 5 years of his, waiting every single day for the past to finally come due. I don't expect mercy, Lady Seris, I expect consequences. After 5 years of watching what the absence of consequences did to your father's soul, I find I would rather have the consequences than the alternative. Ashe looked down at the letter in her hands, her father's own words, his own signature, his own 5-year-old carefully preserved doubt, and felt something shift inside her chest that she had not expected to feel again after everything. Not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not ever. But something adjacent to it, a recognition that the story she had spent 5 years building toward was about to become considerably more complicated than a simple clean reckoning. Her father had known, her father had doubted, and her father had chosen with his own hand to write that doubt down and hide it rather than act on it, which meant that whatever judgment finally came for House Draymoor would have to reckon not with a monster who felt nothing, but with a coward who had felt everything and buried it anyway. Because the throne he wanted mattered more to him than the daughter he claimed to love. Somehow she was discovering that was so much worse. "Bring the letter and yourself to Kalen Voss's office tomorrow morning," she said finally. "Tell him everything you told me tonight. And Master Rain, thank you for finally choosing the harder thing, even 5 years too late." She left the grain warehouse with the letter folded inside her coat against the same ribs the sea had once tried to crush, and walked back through Velmore's sleeping streets toward the townhouse she'd rented under the name Ashe Corvine, understanding that the trial she had spent 5 years engineering was no longer simply about proving her own innocence. It was about forcing her father to finally look at what his choice had cost, and this time there would be no turning his face away. Duke Aldrich Draymoor had chosen the Autumn Harvest Festival for Ophelia's betrothal announcement quite deliberately, a season of public goodwill, crowded streets, and the kind of festive noise that made it easy to bury any awkward questions beneath music and wine. He had not in 5 years entirely stopped feeling the small, persistent itch of a conscience he refused to examine too closely, and some part of him had chosen this loud, celebratory setting the way a man chooses to hold an important conversation in a room with the television turned up, not because it made the conversation easier, but because it made the silence afterward less noticeable. He did not know that Kalen Voss had, 3 days earlier, formally filed a Crown petition for a treason investigation into House Draymoor's fortification funding, supported by intercepted correspondence, corroborated garrison ledgers, and a steward's sworn confession. He did not know that Ren Ashcombe had quietly resigned his position as the Duke's private investigator that same week, citing reasons he declined to specify, and had instead accepted a temporary commission as a Crown witness. He did not know. Standing on the dais above Draymoor Hall's great courtyard with Ophelia beside him in her betrothal gown, and Ivan glowing with 5 years' worth of patient satisfaction that the Crown's own royal inspectors, the actual official kind with the actual official authority his hastily invoked right of correction had denied his elder daughter 5 years earlier, were at that very moment moving quietly through the crowd toward the dais. He noticed the woman first because she was standing entirely still in a courtyard full of festival movement, silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a merchant's fine but unremarkable coat, watching him with an expression he could not quite place and did not, for one more precious moment, recognize. Duke Aldrich Draymoor, Kalen Voss's voice cut through the festival noise, carrying the particular authority of a royal official invoking Crown business in a public setting, and the courtyard's cheerful chatter died in ragged, spreading waves as the crowd realized something was happening that was not part of the planned festivities. "By order of the Crown, you are to answer formal charges of treason against the realm, specifically regarding a 5-year concealment of border fortification leaks to House Vey of Ashkar, and the wrongful execution of an innocent party in place of the true offender." "This is an outrage," Ivan said, recovering first, her voice pitched with practiced, indignant authority. "My husband is a loyal servant of the Crown, and whatever slander—" "It is not slander, Lady Ivan," Kalen said, and something in his tone made her voice die in her throat. "It is corroborated by garrison ledgers, intercepted correspondence in House Vey's own hand, and a sworn confession from your household's own steward, who has been in Crown custody since yesterday morning." He turned to the Duke, whose face had gone the particular gray-white color of a man watching 5 years of careful denial collapse in real time. "Cassian Rain has confessed to selling fortification schedules to House Vey for over 2 years, prior to and continuing after Lady Seris Draymoor's execution for the same crime. He has also provided the Crown with a document in your own hand, Your Grace, dated the night before her sentencing, acknowledging that you possessed no true evidence of her guilt." The courtyard had gone entirely silent now, 300 festival guests frozen in the particular horrified stillness of people watching a public execution of an entirely different kind. A reputation, unraveling in real time, in front of everyone who had ever curried favor with it. "That document was private," Aldrich said, and his voice came out smaller than Ashe had ever heard it, smaller than the voice that had once said take the traitor away without so much as a tremor. "It reflected a father's grief, nothing more. It reflected," said the woman with silver-streaked hair, stepping forward at last from the crowd, and every head in the courtyard turned toward her, "a father's certain knowledge that his daughter was innocent written in his own hand. The night before he had her thrown off a cliff into the Straits of Kell with her wrists bound. Nothing more and nothing less." Aldrich Draymoor looked at her the way a man looks at a ghost, Not with the theatrical shock of festival drama, but with the slow, sick, dawning horror of arithmetic he had spent 5 years refusing to complete finally, unavoidably, resolving itself in front of him. The silver in her hair, the set of her jaw unchanged since childhood, the particular way she stood still and composed that he had once loved to call Little Hawk and had spent 5 years trying not to remember. "Seris," he said, and it came out as barely more than a breath. "I go by Ashe now," she said. "Seris Draymoor died in the Straits of Kel, Your Grace, exactly as you intended. What's standing in front of you is something considerably less forgiving." Ophelia, who had gone pale and silent beside her mother throughout the entire exchange, found her voice first among the family, and what came out of her was not remorse but pure, undiluted panic. "This changes nothing about the betrothal House Vey has already committed, House Vey." Kalen Voss said with the flat satisfaction of a man delivering the final piece of a case he'd spent 3 years building. Committed to a border alliance built on 2 years of illegally purchased fortification schedules and secured through the wrongful execution of the one woman capable of exposing it. The Crown has already dispatched formal notice voiding the betrothal contract on grounds of treasonous provenance. Lord Raston Vey is, as we speak, being detained by Ashkar's own border authorities, who take considerably less kindly than House Draymoor apparently does to noble scandals threatening their kingdom's stability. Yvain's carefully composed face was cracking now, the practiced grief and indignation giving way to something rower and far less flattering. The calculating panic of a woman watching 5 years of patient scheming collapse in the space of a single conversation. "You," she said, turning on Ashe with sudden vicious clarity, "you were supposed to be dead." "I know," Ashe said. "You said it yourself 5 years ago in this very courtyard while I was being marched toward that cliff. Mercifully, you called it." "I've had 5 years to think about that word, Lady Yvain, and I find I have quite a lot to say to you about what mercy actually looks like." The royal inspectors moved through the frozen courtyard with brisk official efficiency. And Ashe watched, with an emotion she had expected to feel as pure uncomplicated triumph, and instead found considerably more tangled, as guards who had once escorted her toward execution now escorted her father and stepmother toward a very different kind of reckoning. Her father did not resist. He stood very still as the guards approached him, and for one long terrible moment, his eyes met hers across the ruined festival courtyard, and she saw in them something she had spent 5 years imagining she wanted to see and discovered now that it finally arrived. Brought her no satisfaction at all. She saw him finally fully understand what he had done. "Little Hawk," he said, so quietly only she could have heard it over the courtyard's rising chaos. "I have spent 5 years telling myself I would have found a way to save you if only I'd had more time to think, more room to maneuver against Yvain's alliance. I understand now that isn't true. I had all the time in the world. I chose not to use it because the throne I wanted mattered more to me in that single terrible moment than you did. I am not asking you to forgive that. I don't believe I could forgive it myself if our places were reversed." "You're right," Ashe said. "I haven't decided whether I ever will. But you're going to stand trial regardless, Your Grace, in front of the entire Crown Court with actual magistrates and actual evidence, and an actual chance to answer for what you did, the exact process you denied me 5 years ago. Whatever else happens between us, you're finally going to face what a real trial looks like." The guards led him away through a courtyard gone utterly silent, past 300 festival guests who had come to celebrate a betrothal and instead watched a duke-a-duchess. And the entire foundation of House Draymoor's 5-year prosperity collapse in the space of 20 minutes, and Ashe stood alone in the wreckage of it, understanding, with the same cold, clarifying stillness that had carried her through 4 minutes of drowning and 5 years of patient work, that the hardest part of her reckoning had not yet even begun. Because somewhere in the fleeing, panicking crowd, Ophelia Draymoor had just vanished entirely, and something about the particular calculating speed of her disappearance told Ashe this story was not yet finished collapsing. Ophelia had not survived 8 years as Yvain's daughter in a household that valued her only as an instrument of ambition, by being slow to recognize when a plan had failed completely. The moment Kalen Voss's voice cut through the festival crowd, some old, well-practiced part of her inherited, whether she liked to admit it or not, from a mother who had spent 2 decades turning other people's disasters into her own advantage, had already begun calculating an exit. She found Ren Ashcombe waiting for her in the stable yard behind Draymoor Hall, which surprised her not at all once she saw him there, because she had in the chaos of the courtyard correctly guessed that whoever had orchestrated this reckoning would have anticipated exactly this kind of flight, and posted someone to intercept it. You're not going to stop me from leaving, Ophelia said, chin lifted with the same brittle, practiced defiance Ashe remembered from childhood, the tone of a girl who had learned early that confidence, performed convincingly enough, could substitute for actual power. I'm not here to stop you, Ren said. I'm here to give you a choice on Lady Ashe's instruction before you make a decision you can't undo. You can run. You're young, you have resources hidden somewhere I'm sure your mother taught you to keep. And you might well make it across a border before the Crown's investigators think to look for you specifically, since the treason charges currently rest on your parents, not on you. Or you can stay. And tell the Crown investigators the truth about what you actually knew and when you knew it, because Lady Ashe believes, and I find myself inclined to agree with her, that an 18-year-old girl manipulated by an ambitious mother into believing a lie is a considerably different kind of guilty than the mother who built the lie in the first place. Why would she offer me anything? Ophelia's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion Ren had heard from her since this entire chaotic evening began. I smiled while they marched her out of that hall. I tried on pearls that used to be hers before her body was even cold in the water. I have spent 5 years enjoying everything her death purchased for me, and I never once, not for a single day, asked myself whether it was true. I don't know why she's offering it, Ren said honestly. I only know she gave me very specific instructions to find you before you fled, and to tell you this, that the version of yourself you have 5 years left to become is not yet fixed, no matter what the version of yourself from 5 years ago chose to do. She said you'd understand what that meant better than I would. Ophelia stood very still in the stable yard, the festival chaos still audible in the distance, torches guttering in the autumn wind. And something in Ren's careful recitation of a message that clearly wasn't originally meant for him seemed to reach some buried, uncomfortable part of her that 8 years of Yvain's careful lessons in ambition had never quite managed to fully extinguish. She actually said that, Ophelia repeated slowly. The version of myself I have 5 years left to become. Word for word, Ren said. I asked her to clarify and she told me it would make sense to you specifically and to no one else. It did make sense. And the reason it made sense broke something open in Ophelia's chest that she had spent 5 years very carefully keeping closed because those words, almost exactly those words, were the last thing her own mother had said to her the night before Seris's sentencing. Sitting at Ophelia's dressing table brushing out her hair with the particular tenderness Yvain reserved for moments of real strategic importance. You have 5 years to become the daughter this family actually needs, Ophelia. Don't waste them feeling sorry for a girl who is always going to be an obstacle to you eventually, one way or another. Better it happens now, on our terms, than later on hers. Ophelia had believed her mother, at 17, with the particular desperate hunger of a girl who had spent her entire childhood watching an older half-sister effortlessly earn the love and respect that never seemed to come as easily to her. She had told herself for 5 years that Seris's death had simply been an unfortunate cost of a system she hadn't built and couldn't have stopped. She understood now, standing in a stable yard with her whole carefully constructed life collapsing around her, that this had always been a story she told herself specifically, so she would never have to examine what she had actually chosen, and kept choosing every single day for 5 years that she smiled and wore pearls and never once asked an honest question. I don't know how to undo any of it, she said, and her voice, for the first time in Ren's admittedly limited experience of her, sounded genuinely, uncertainly young. I don't think Lady Ashe is offering you a way to undo it, Ren said. I think she's offering you a chance to stop making it worse. Those aren't the same thing, and I suspect she'd want you to understand the difference clearly before you decide anything. Ophelia did not run that night. She walked back through Draymoor Hall's chaos-ravaged courtyard. Past guests fleeing in whispered scandal, past guards escorting her mother toward a crown carriage, while Yvain screamed increasingly wild accusations that no one any longer had any interest in believing, and found Kaelin Voss overseeing the last details of the arrests with the exhausted, methodical calm of a man finishing a job he'd spent 3 years building toward. I want to give a statement, she said. Everything I knew, and when I knew it, and every single thing I did to make certain I never had to look at it honestly. I understand that it will probably mean consequences for me too. I would rather have those consequences than spend one more day telling myself the story I've been telling myself for 5 years. It was Ashe would reflect later, watching from across the wrecked courtyard as her half-sister gave her statement to a crowned scribe with her chin no longer lifted in practiced defiance, but bowed instead in something that looked almost like the beginning of genuine reckoning. The one outcome of this entire 5-year campaign she had genuinely not planned for, and had not until the exact moment she told Ren what message to deliver been entirely certain she wanted. She had spent 5 years imagining this night as a clean, total collapse of everyone who had wronged her. Her father broken, her stepmother exposed, her half-sister destroyed alongside them. A complete and symmetrical justice with no loose threads left dangling. She had not planned for the possibility that one of those threads might, given an honest chance and an honest choice, actually choose to become something other than what her mother had built her to be. She was still turning that unexpected possibility over in her mind. Standing alone at the edge of the wrecked festival courtyard, as the last of the crown carriages pulled away into the autumn night carrying her father and stepmother toward formal crown custody, when a voice she had not heard in 5 years low, and careful and entirely unexpected, spoke from the shadows behind her. "You did all of this without a sword," the voice said. "I don't believe I've ever seen anyone burn down an entire noble house using nothing but patience and other people's own confessions." Ashe turned and found herself looking at the one person from her old life she had never once in 5 years of careful planning expected to encounter again. Captain Yorick Thane, the garrison commander's son she had once briefly and painfully been in love with at 19. Before the sea had taken that life along with everything else in it. Yorick Thane had aged into exactly the kind of man his father had always predicted he'd become, broader through the shoulders, a soldier's steadiness in his stance, a small scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He was looking at Ashe now with an expression that mixed disbelief, hope, and something else considerably more complicated, an expression she recognized because she suspected her own face was doing something similarly complicated in return. "You're supposed to be dead," he said, echoing without knowing it. The exact words Yvain had spat at her not 20 minutes earlier, though the tone could not have been more different. Yvain's had been pure panic and Yorick's was something closer to 5 years of carefully buried grief finally cautiously allowing itself to hope. "So I've been told twice tonight already," Ashe said. "I'm growing tired of correcting people." "I looked for you," Yorick said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the composed soldier's steadiness fracturing just enough to let something rower through. "After they said you'd been sentenced, before they even took you to the Straits, I rode 3 days to try to reach your father and argue for a proper trial. I was too late. By the time I reached Draymoor Hall, you were already gone, and your father wouldn't even see me. Yvain's guards turned me away at the gate and told me the matter was closed. I spent the next year having every fishing captain along that coast quietly search for wreckage, for a body, for anything, because I couldn't make myself believe you were simply gone with nothing left behind to grieve properly. I found nothing. Eventually I told myself I had to stop, because the searching was destroying me, and because everyone around me kept saying the kindest thing I could do for my own future was let a dead woman rest. I'm sorry you spent a year searching for nothing," Ashe said. And found to her own surprise that she meant it. A small genuine ache surfacing amid 5 years of far larger griefs, for a version of her own life that had been taken from her along with everything else that terrible morning. "Don't apologize for surviving," Yorick said, with sudden, fierce clarity. "I spent a year grieving a woman who deserved to be alive far more than she deserved to be thrown off a cliff for a crime she never committed. Whatever I feel about the year I lost searching, none of it is your fault, and I won't have you carrying guilt for that on top of everything else your family has already made you carry." They stood together at the edge of the wrecked courtyard for a long moment, the autumn wind carrying the last scattered debris of a betrothal festival that would be remembered for generations, as the night House Draymoor finally collapsed under the weight of its own 5-year-old lie. And Ashe found herself for the first time since the water had closed over her head 5 years earlier uncertain what to say next, not because she lacked words, but because she had spent 5 years so thoroughly focused on reckoning and reconstruction that she had almost entirely forgotten what it felt like to stand in front of someone and simply quietly be grateful they were there. "I'm not the same person you looked for," she said finally. "The woman you knew at 19 believed her father would always protect her, believed the world generally rewarded honesty and competence, believed love was simple because she'd never yet had a reason to test it against real betrayal. I've spent 5 years becoming someone who trusts almost nothing without independent verification, who has learned to read a room of strangers for weakness before she reads it for friendship, who built an entire 5-year campaign to bring down her own family using nothing but patience and other people's confessions. I don't know if that woman is someone you'd still recognize, let alone still." She stopped herself before the sentence finished, unwilling to finish it and be wrong. "I don't need you to be the same person," Yorick said. "I spent a year grieving a 19-year-old girl I loved, and 5 more years becoming a different man myself. one who commands his own garrison company now and has learned considerably harder lessons about loyalty and betrayal than I'd ever wanted to learn. I'm not asking the woman standing in front of me to be anyone she isn't anymore. I'm asking whether the person she's become might have room, somewhere in 5 years of careful, necessary armor, for something that isn't strategy. Ashe looked at him for a long moment and felt something in her chest, some old, guarded, carefully bricked-over place, shift, just slightly, the way a stone shifts after 5 years of relentless tide finally finds the one weak point in a seawall. I don't know yet, she said honestly, because the quiet widow had taught her, above almost everything else, the value of an honest answer over a comfortable lie. I have a trial to see through first. My father, my stepmother, they'll stand before crown magistrates in the coming weeks. And I intend to be in that courtroom for every single day of it, because I promised myself 5 years ago in a smuggler's cave that I would make them face a real accounting. And I don't break promises I've made to the version of myself who nearly drowned to keep them. After that, I honestly don't know what comes after that. I've spent 5 years so entirely focused on this one goal that I've barely let myself imagine what a life looks like once it's finished. Then let me be patient the way you've apparently learned to be, Yorick said, with the first real smile she'd seen on his face since he'd stepped out of the shadows. I waited a year for a body that never came. I imagine I can wait considerably longer for a woman who's actually, impossibly, standing right in front of me. The trial of House Draymoor began 11 days later, in the Crown's grandest courtroom, before 3 royal magistrates and a public gallery packed with nobles who had, only weeks earlier, competed for invitations to Ophelia's betrothal festival, and now competed instead for seats to watch her family's downfall. Duke Aldrich Draymoor did not contest the charges. He stood before the magistrates, aged a decade in the space of a single autumn, and confessed to everything, the forged evidence he had chosen not to question. The right of correction he had invoked specifically to avoid the scrutiny. A real trial would have brought the marriage alliance he had valued above his own daughter's life, and the private letter written in his own trembling hand the night before her sentencing. Acknowledging a doubt he had chosen to bury rather than act on, Yvain fought every charge to the last possible moment, hiring 3 separate advocates and attempting in a final desperate gambit to claim that Cassian Rain's confession had been coerced by Ashe herself, a claim that collapsed entirely under Kaelin Voss's methodical 3-year-old paper trail, and Ren Ashcombe's sworn testimony regarding the Duke's private investigation into a merchant financier who had in the end simply been asking the questions Yvain had spent 5 years hoping no one would ever think to ask. Ophelia testified against her own mother in careful, halting detail, describing the exact conversation at her dressing table the night before Seris's sentencing. And though her testimony did not spare her entirely from consequence, the Crown magistrates ultimately imposed a lengthy period of supervised exile from court rather than the far harsher sentence her parents received. It marked Ashe understood watching from the gallery. The first entirely honest choice her half-sister had made in 5 years and possibly in her entire life. The magistrates deliberated for 2 days. On the 3rd day they returned a verdict that Ashe had spent 5 years building toward brick by careful brick, letter by careful letter, confession by careful confession. Duke Aldrich Draymoor and Lady Yvain Draymoor guilty of treason, conspiracy, and the wrongful execution of an innocent noblewoman stripped of title, land, and name. Sentenced to the same fate the Duke had once invoked so casually against his own daughter. Permanent exile beyond Velmore's borders, with the added deliberate cruelty of full public knowledge of exactly why. They allowed her one final conversation with her father in the small stone antechamber behind the courtroom, before the Crown Guards led him away to begin the long journey to permanent exile. Yvain had refused any final words at all, spitting bitter accusations at everyone within earshot until the guards finally led her out, still shouting. Ashe had expected, honestly, to feel nothing at missing that particular conversation, and found she was right. Her father looked smaller in the stone antechamber than he had ever looked in her entire childhood, stripped of the ducal coronet and formal robes that had always seemed, to a much younger Seris, as much a part of him as his own skin. He looked more than anything like an old man who had finally run entirely out of ways to avoid an honest reckoning. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said before she could speak. "I told you that in the courtyard, and I meant it, and 5 years of watching what my own choice cost you has only made me more certain I don't deserve it. I only wanted the chance to say one true thing to you before they take me away. Because I spent 19 years of your life saying a great many things that were kind, but not always entirely honest, and I find at the end of everything that I would rather leave you with something true." Say it then, Ashe said and found her voice steadier than she'd expected. You were always the better Draymoor, her father said. Not because of blood or birth order or anything I could claim credit for teaching you. You were better because even at 19 years old, watching me condemn you with no evidence and no trial, you never once became the kind of person who does to others what was done to you. You built an entire reckoning against this family using nothing but patience, honest evidence, and other people's own confessions. You gave Ophelia a chance to become something better than her mother raised her to be, when you had every reason in the world to want her destroyed alongside the rest of us. I spent 5 years becoming smaller and more frightened with every year that passed, hoping the past would simply stay buried. You spent the same 5 years becoming something I was never brave enough to be. Even at the height of my own power, someone who could look directly at the worst thing that had ever happened to her and choose deliberately precisely what kind of person she wanted to become in response. I am sorrier than I know how to say, Little Hawk, that it took losing everything for me to finally see that clearly. But I do see it now, and I wanted you to hear me say it honestly before the chance was gone. Ashe stood in the small stone antechamber for a long moment looking at the broken, honest man her father had finally at the very end allowed himself to become, and felt something in her chest settle. Not into forgiveness, not entirely. Because some wounds 5 years deep do not close simply because the person who caused them finally tells the truth, but into something quieter and in its own way more valuable. A clean final understanding that she did not need his approval or his guilt or even his love. To know the truth of who she had become, she had known it already alone in a smuggler's cave with the tide roaring outside. She had simply needed him at the very end to know it too. Goodbye, father, she said. I hope exile gives you the time you never gave me, time to become someone worth the doubt you wrote down and buried, instead of the man who buried it. She did not watch the guards lead him away. She walked instead out of the Crown Courthouse into a bright, clean autumn afternoon, where Yorick Thane was waiting exactly where he'd told her he would be, and Ren Ashcombe stood a respectful distance away in his new Crown Commission. And Kaelin Voss was already deep in conversation with a clerk about the formal restoration of her title. And lands a restoration the Crown had ordered as part of the verdict 5 years, and one entire reckoning too late to undo what had already been taken but not too late. Ashe understood standing in the clean autumn light to build something new on top of it. Ophelia found her 3 days later in the half-restored halls of what had once been Draymoor Hall, and would by winter formally become Ashe's own household once again. And stood in the doorway of what had been their mother's old rooms with a hesitance that hadn't existed in the confident, brittle girl who'd once tried on pearls before Seris's body was even cold in the water. I don't know what to ask you for, Ophelia said. Forgiveness feels like too much to want, and I'm not certain I deserve even permission to still be standing in this house. I'm not offering you forgiveness yet, Ashe said honestly, because the quiet widow had taught her, above nearly everything else, the value of an honest answer over a comfortable one. That's going to take longer than 3 days for both of us, and I won't pretend otherwise just to make this conversation easier. What I'm offering is a chance, the same chance I gave you in that stable yard, on the worst night of both our lives. 5 years to become someone worth trusting. I can't promise you I'll ever entirely stop remembering the pearls, Ophelia. But I find, strangely, that I don't want to spend the next 5 years the way our father spent the last 5. So afraid of an honest reckoning that I bury every doubt rather than look directly at it. You chose honesty in that courtroom when lying would have been considerably easier. I intend to give that choice the weight it deserves. Ophelia's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire story she did not try to hide it behind practiced composure. Thank you, she said. I don't know how to earn that. I only know I intend to try. That evening, standing on the same high wall of the practice yard, where a much younger Seris had once perched to watch soldiers train and earned herself the nickname that had followed her through betrayal. Exile and reckoning alike, Ashe watched the sun go down over land that was after 5 impossible years formally hers again. Not because a father had given it to her out of love, but because a crown court had returned it to her out of law, which she found. Standing in the cooling autumn air was a considerably steadier foundation to build a life on than love had ever proven to be in her family. Yorick found her there as the last light faded and did not say anything at first, only came to stand beside her at the wall's edge, patient in exactly the way he'd promised to be. What do you think you'll do now? He asked finally, with a hall and a title and 5 years' worth of quiet widow's training and no reckoning left to plan. Ashe considered the question for a long moment, looking out over land that had once been the whole of her world, and had then been taken entirely away, and now, improbably, belonged to her again. I think, she said, I'll rebuild something worth the name Draymoor actually means, instead of what my father let it become. I think I'll teach whatever daughters or nieces come after me that competence doesn't need a body to excuse it, and that love which requires you to stay silent about your own doubts isn't love at all, only convenience wearing love's face. And I think, she added, glancing sideways at Yorick with the first genuinely unguarded smile she'd allowed herself in 5 long years, I might for the first time since the sea tried, and failed to keep me let myself want something simply because it makes me happy instead of because it serves a larger plan. The tide came in far below the cliffs of Velmore that night, the same restless braided current that had once tried to take everything from her. And Ashe Draymoor, no longer needing the smaller name that had carried her safely through 5 years of exile and reckoning, stood on the wall above at home at last, not because the family that raised her had ever truly deserved her, but because she had finally completely built a version of home that deserved her instead. The sea keeps many things. It had tried once to keep her. It had failed, and in failing had given her back to the world as something considerably stronger than the girl it had first swallowed, and that, in the end, was the only revenge that had ever truly mattered. Not the ruin of the people who wronged her, though that ruin had come precise and complete and entirely earned, but the simple, unbreakable fact of her own survival standing tall in the autumn wind. Exactly where she had always belonged.